Well, this week, the agenda got up close and personal with wearable technology, offered sage advice to Toronto's new mayor, we got some just there, and looked at the rise of the extreme right in Europe. But the agenda's week in review begins by asking how free, how secure.
This is a poll done by the Associated Press this year. 61% of Americans saying that protecting their rights and freedoms was more important to them than making sure they were safe from terrorists. This is 13 years after 9/11, when I'm sure you would have got a very different response 13 years ago. Now, Canadians were polled by the Privacy Commissioner about how comfortable they are with telecommunications companies, for example, giving over private information, the metadata, name, telephone number, or addresses to police or intelligence agencies without a warrant. And anywhere from 52 to 60% were okay with it. So we seem to be, as this needle buffets back and forth, we seem to be more on the side of, we don't mind giving up some of our freedoms now if it potentially means we're going to be safer. What's your view on that?
Well, I think that we still haven't had the kind of post-Snowden conversation in this country that we have seen in some other jurisdictions, which I think helps explain to a certain extent why some Canadians may say that they're comfortable with the disclosure of the information, in part because I'm not sure that they're fully aware of both the implications of some of that disclosure and just how widespread some of those practices are. I contrast the kinds of things that we can clearly see with those that we don't. Here in Ottawa, Parliament Hill is open again, and that's something everybody can see. And for many people in Ottawa, that's something that we really treasure. It's part of being that kind of open democracy that Canada's all about, so that you can have yoga on the lawn, and people really feel that that openness is critical. And to give that up would be seen as a true loss in the way that Hugh Segal talked about. The kind of disclosures you just described, the subscriber information, the sort of NSA-related surveillance that we see taking place, that's stuff we don't see, and that's stuff we're not often aware of. And so in a sense, I don't know that people can relate to it in quite the same way they can with, quite literally, a lawn in front of Parliament.
Let me ask you, though, Hugh Segal, about a building that you know all too well. They call it the Pink Palace at the top of University Avenue in downtown Toronto. You were Chief of Staff to former Premier Bill Davis there for many years. When you had that job, anybody at any time could walk into that building and go anywhere.
That's right.
Nowadays, and this has been the case, not since last week, but in fact, for 20 years at least, you can't get past security at the front desk unless you've got a reason for being in that building. And if you want to watch question period, you're walking through a metal detector.
Correct.
We've changed already, haven't we?
Yes, and that, to be fair, that's been the case on Parliament Hill for some time, because over the last 3 decades, we've had people throwing a quart of blood onto the chamber floor. We've had someone trying to assemble a bomb in a washroom, and it blew up in the washroom, thank goodness, not killing anybody other than the prospective assailant. So they have been tightening up on a pretty substantive basis. I think part of the challenge is, how do you maintain that access on the one hand, and on the other hand, keep the people who are making use of that access safe when they're there? To the everlasting credit of the Sergeant at Arms, there would have been a lot of school children and a lot of junior aides from MPs' offices in the Library of Parliament doing their work on a Wednesday morning. If the shooter had gotten into that particular facility, we would have had either a massive hostage taking or something far worse. So the notion that they had to bring him down where they did, I think, is part of how the people who are part of our security apparatus in the Houses of Parliament keep everybody in the Houses of Parliament safe, including the thousands of visitors who come through every week. So again, it's the balance and the challenge.
Veronica.
I think we should also remember that physical blockages are not the whole answer.
What does that mean?
As we've heard, Parliament Hill is protected by the RCMP, Parliament Hill Security, the Ottawa Police. There's a lot of jurisdictions, and we know that in a crisis, events can overwhelm your protocols. Mm-hmm. So training and practicing and making sure that everybody can move in and out of roles as necessary also becomes important when you're thinking about securing complicated spaces like the downtown of an urban center.
I would think, for example, that ministerial drivers, one having been taken out of his car at gunpoint so that the car could be used by the shooter to get up to the center block quickly, because other cars can't get into Parliament unless you have proper certification. those drivers have the right to ask for some training now to deal with those kinds of circumstances.
Should they be armed?
Well, I don't know that, but I think they probably need some training. It's one thing to be trained in defensive driving when you're driving your minister and there's some risk, but it's another thing when you're waiting for your minister and someone decides with a gun to take you out for the purpose of using that car for nefarious purposes. What training does that driver have? My bet is this driver had no training. He reacted appropriately. No one else was killed, to his credit. But those are the whole bunch of things governments can do that don't have to change anybody's rights and freedoms, that could in fact increase our capacity to respond as an organization.
Mubin, do we need to arm more people at our places of democracy now in order to...
I don't know about arming more people. I do believe in arming the right type of people. And secondly, target hardening or site hardening. Some aspect of that will be required. If you look at the driveway that goes right up to the front door of the Parliament, you could have a panic switch that enables a big metal plate that will block any car from getting past 3 feet. That's not expensive. It's very simple. You will need somebody to monitor the grounds at all times. I hope that kind of level of surveillance of the grounds does happen. Don't forget, Greenpeace not too long ago, they unfurled their banner right from the roof of Parliament Hill.
Yes.
These are unacceptable. These things it should not be happening. When I was operational on the Toronto 18 case, they actually thought of this, running up and storming the Parliament building. And I thought to myself, that can't be done. You would think that there would be security. I was wrong.
Well, we're not alone in this, right? A few people have managed to hop the fence at the White House in Washington and shoot bullets in the White House for
security people, if I may say so, did a far better job of stopping the alleged assailants before they penetrated as deeply as was the case in the White House or in the Center for Disease Control, where an armed individual who was a former prison inmate stood next to the President of the United States in an elevator. That has not happened in Canada, nor do I think it ever would.
Let's not wait for it to happen either. We should, prevention's better than cure. Absolutely.
Wesley Wark, I think you described it as an old normal. You don't think this is a new normal. This is an old normal, meaning we've been at this before. But the fact is, we seem to have, I just gave the example of Queen's Park a few moments ago, we seem to have given up some of our civil rights already in terms of unfettered access to these buildings that are at the heart of our democracy. And yet, anybody with a gun who wants to shoot his way in is still going to be able to do that. We're not going to be able to stop that, are we?
I'm sure there are professional ways in which we can provide better physical security for Parliament, for example. I think it has to be understood that there was what I always thought of as a good model that had been erected around security on Parliament Hill, and that model was to keep the public spaces in front of the Parliament buildings open as much as possible for public access, but to essentially try and lock down the Parliament buildings in terms of access and circulation themselves. That model failed to some degree with regard to the Wednesday attack, but as Hugh Siegel said, not all of that gravely at the end of the day. The response was very, very rapid, and that rapid response allowed for the prevention of any greater tragedy or loss of life. And going back a bit further and just broadening this out, I think Canadians should understand, and when I say the old normal, I'm really talking about a post 9/11 old normal. We could go further back in time if you like, but we debated this issue of what were the appropriate balances or ways to both achieve security, national security, human security, and maintain democratic and civil rights. We debated it in the fall of 2001 when the anti-terrorism legislation was passed. And I think it'd be worthwhile to reflect on the nature of that debate as Parliament moves forward now to debate whatever new legislation the government will bring in. The thing that I remember from that time very strongly, the debate was by and large very non-partisan and very deeply engaged, both in Parliament and in the public. And there were some very useful amendments made to the original version of the Anti-Terrorism Act in the course of that debate. I would hope that'd be the model for us moving forward, recognizing that we already have a good and workable set of arrangements for dealing with security and protecting civil liberties. And let's make sure that we don't do anything rash that destroys that balance.
I want to start with you, John Sewell, because you were here a week ago telling everybody to vote for Olivia Chow, and I wonder how disappointed you are with the outcome.
Boy, did she do badly. 22% of the vote. Now, of course, that's what the polls said, so I wasn't surprised, but I was disappointed. And of course, when she gave her speech, was I disappointed in that too?
What didn't you like?
Oh, I just thought it was so flat, absolutely flat. It just didn't have anything to commend it.
Conversely, I think you liked the outcome, didn't you?
Oh, I love the outcome. I'm grateful we have a new mayor to start with after the dysfunction and the circus that's existed here at City Hall for the last 4 years. It's good to have a new leadership at City Hall, but he's going to have to work with the council too, and I think he's the right person to do it. So I'm grateful he got the job, John Tory.
We'll talk about Mississauga in a second, but I want first of all to find out, you endorsed John Tory, even though you're in Mississauga and he's Toronto. So I presume you're happy with the outcome.
I'm happy with the outcome because I believe the Mayor of Toronto has to play a leadership role in getting the Greater Toronto Area together. We are the economic engine of Canada, and we're not working on all cylinders by any way. Dealing with the gridlock, with economic development, we must work together, and I believe John Tory will do that because he's already done it when he wasn't mayor. He worked with the Greater Toronto Marketing Alliance. It's time that Toronto realized that they got to work with the municipalities around because our population around Toronto is the same size as Toronto and is growing far more rapidly than Toronto is growing.
When Rob Ford was mayor, how actively did you think he saw to the interests of the whole region as opposed to just the 416?
He clearly indicated to me that he was only interested in Toronto. He did come to the ice storm when I called all the mayors together and the regional chairs, and Norm Kelly came as well. And with a unanimous vote by the mayors and the chairs, we got what we asked for. We asked for assistance from the province, and they came through with assistance for us to deal with the ice storm. That is proof positive that we must work together for the good of Toronto and for the good of the municipalities around Toronto. John Tory, in my opinion, will do that.
I would like, not many people know this, I would like the longest serving mayor in Toronto history, who I'm looking at right now, to give some advice to John Tory. He's very happy today because he's won. What's job one for him right now?
Job one, I think, is building relationship with the city councillors. He's one of 45 votes, and you have to get your program through by fashioning majorities on each issue as you go along. It's not a party system. It's a matter of being able to coax the members of council to come along with your agenda. So I think what he has to do is call them all and talk with them briefly, and then set up subsequent meetings between now and when the official swearing in occurs, so that he can tell them of the things that he would like to move on and hear from them on the things they want to move on. So I think building that relationship at this point is very key. I mean, there's other things too, but building his team to run the mayor's office, of course, is very important as well. You have to do that in this period of time. But I think building relationships with the members of city council is a very important job.
So would you call one-on-one meetings, each councillor come into the mayor's office?
Yes. I think every mayor should do that. I think the earlier that can be done, the better. Now, subsequently also, he needs to, it's an ongoing endeavor to keep in touch with the members of city council. He's going to need an assistant who can walk down the halls by the corridors of the city council members and keep in touch with them. And so that's an important part of the job as well.
John Sewell, if he called you tomorrow and said, what's the first thing I should do as the new mayor, what would you tell him?
Oh, I'd agree with Art. The key thing is trying to figure out who you're going to work with on city council. I mean, John Tory's used to working in a party system where you're the leader, here's the rules, blah, blah, oh, we'll have a little feedback, but fine, I make the decisions.
They didn't listen to him when he did that, incidentally.
Well, and the point is that you try that at City Hall, tough luck, you're going to be in trouble. And he's got some big choices to make right away. Who's going to chair the committees? Who's going to be on the executive committee? And the question is whether he can put together an interesting team to do that. And it's going to be a challenge for him. Because there's a real serious divisions among council. The people elected in the former city of Toronto are generally very progressive, and the people outside of it in the suburbs are not. So he's going to have to figure out, what do you do there? And we know that his base is in the city of Toronto and in North York, and he did badly in Scarborough and badly in Northern Etobicoke, the places without transit. So how's he going to fix all? So he's got to sit down, as Art says, with every person and sort out how he's going to put together a really strong, cohesive team of people who are going to help him govern.
I think for the executive committee, he's got to look, getting some good, smart people with nice, innovative ideas. He has to get a better gender balance. I don't think there is any at the moment. It's all men. There needs to be
women on the executive.
Yeah. And yes, that's terrible. And the next thing he also has to do is to make sure that Scarborough, North York, Etobicoke, that all of the elements of the city are on that executive. He's got to reach out to all parts of Toronto.
I don't think, Mayor McCallion, John Tory needs to be told that he needs more women on the executive committee, but can you imagine they've had zero to date? He's going to do something about that, I presume.
Well, I think he should do something about it. I think what John Tory has to, which I had to do, I was in the private sector, very successful in a management position. And the way you run the private sector in regard to managing is quite different to when you get in the public sector. So I think he has to adjust to the public sector. There's certain things you just can't do from your experience in the private sector. And that's been his experience. He's now in the public sector. I agree with both gentlemen that the council in the city of Toronto is, I always explained there were 3 zoos in the Toronto, the real one at Queen's Park, and one at the city of Toronto. So they had 3 zoos. And I think that has got to be eliminated. Right. And I guess working with the councillors, you got to make the councillors feel that their ideas or their suggestions are not overlooked.
Well, to that end, I'm going to read a graphic here. I was on the phone with Mel Lastman the other day getting some advice from him. He was the first mayor of the megacity. And we're calling this graphic, Who Else Gives Advice Like Mel Lastman? Nobody. Here's what he says. Before I became the mayor, I said I was going to include everyone, despite party stripe. We needed to have everyone on board. So I put Olivia Chow on the police board and gave her responsibility for childcare. Joe Pantalone, another NDP councillor, became an advocate for planting trees. David Miller, another New Democrat, became the mayor, wanted improvements on council proceedings. I did it all. I made them all feel part of the council. We fought and disagreed on many things, but it's wrong if you only give important jobs to people who support you. This is a Lastmanism here. That's El Toro Poo-Poo. Rob Ford got angry and threw people off committees. That's crazy. You'll need them next time, and you won't get them. So here's the question. Should John Tory put some of his enemies is too strong, his political adversaries, into key positions?
Absolutely. I think Mel is right on. I may not have agreed with him on the Shepherd line, but anyway, I certainly would agree with him on this. He shouldn't expect to have that executive marching to his tune 100%. He should have people there that will challenge him, and that occasionally some of that executive will vote against a position that he takes.
Should he put Rob Ford, who's now a city councillor, on the executive?
I'm not going to get into personalities. He has to find a balance. As I said, he has to find a balance that brings all of the component parts, Scarborough, North York, Etobicoke, City of Toronto, et cetera, into play, and the gender balance. So he's got to look at a number of factors here. But I certainly agree with what Mel says.
We quoted something from Geocurrents at the top of the program, and I want to read another excerpt from that as well. We're calling this graphic, And Hatred for All. Here's the quote. Xenophobia is often equally harsh against other European or so-called white immigrants, particularly Albanians, Bosniaks, Greeks, Ukrainians, Bulgarians, Poles, Balts, Romanians, and Russians. In Italy, the center-right Lega Nord, the Northern League, is more xenophobic towards Southern Italians than towards Muslims. The Golden Dawn of Greece is viciously hostile towards Albanians. In Switzerland, xenophobia is mostly directed against immigrants from the former Yugoslavia. Whereas most major xenophobic parties are not overtly anti-Semitic, Hungary's Jobbik is widely seen as not just anti-Zionist, but anti-Jewish and deeply anti-Ziganist, anti-Gypsy as well. Randall, again, the follow-up here. Why does this phenomenon translate into violence, it seems, particularly in Hungary and Greece, but not necessarily elsewhere?
Well, in both of those cases, I think there's two things going on. I mean, this is these criminal activities are being committed by individuals from the extremes who have been sort of absorbed into the far-right parties, and they've identified themselves with a fascist past in a way that North Europeans really wouldn't dream of. That's point one. Point two, you have a more extreme situation in Hungary and in Greece. You have extreme poverty in parts of eastern Hungary where this conflict is really most severe with the Roma. And as Doug was saying, the economic implosion in Greece has been absolutely massive. So it's not surprising that you're getting a different set of outcomes there than in Germany or Northern England.
The murders of 6 members of the Roma community highlighted in this documentary, Judgment in Hungary. Cass, let me go to you on this. How did this play out across the nation?
Well, Hungary, like the rest of Eastern Europe, particularly Central Eastern Europe, has a fairly long history of anti-Roma sentiment, as well as these kind of hate crimes, sometimes even pogroms. And when you look at pretty much all of the survey evidence, like anti-Roma prejudice is way higher than any of the other prejudices. The reason why this gets more play than, to a certain extent, a lot of similar actions that were reasonably common in countries like Czech Republic and Slovakia and Hungary in the 1990s is most notably the rise of Jobbik. And Jobbik has, as part of, its link to the party is the so-called Hungarian Guard, which is as you see it here, which is an unarmed paramilitary unit that has moved into eastern Hungarian towns where there are tensions with Roma and have intimidated them. And so this is all placed within that larger rise of Jobbik story, which is quite interesting because it's also used by Fidesz, the mainstream right-wing party, which is often accused of being very nationalist. The whole rise of Jobbik is very much used by Fidesz to say, look, you have to, by and large, forgive us for all our illiberal things that we do, because we're the only ones that stand in between democracy and the rise of and the overtaking of this neo-fascist, neo-Nazi unit of Jobbik and the Hungarian Guard.
And Cass, when the hatred boils over and violence and or murder is the result, can you give us a sense about what happens to broader public support for these groups that do these things?
Well, often the groups don't really do these things. And so the vast majority of racist crime, and particularly murders, are committed by people who are not members of any political party and tend to be, if at all, associated to very small groups. In countries like Hungary, where among potential Jobbik supporters, like anti-Roma sentiments are so incredibly high, this will not have much effect on their support for Jobbik. Many will feel that it is a consequence of Roma crime, and so they will support the vigilance. So we shouldn't be overly optimistic to think that this type of crime will lead everyone to think like, oh yeah, we were wrong for the last hundreds of years in our anti-Roma sentiment.
There are certainly people who are alive and living in Greece today who have firsthand memories of the Germans, Nazi Germany, walking into Greece and occupying that country for 4 years during World War II. How is it possible then that Golden Dawn, which is the far-right movement in Greece, garners any support at all given its neo-Nazi tendencies?
Well, you have to keep in mind that Greece has gone through several major socioeconomic changes, including a major shift to democracy, and also joining the European Union, and then, of course, the economic downturn that has hit Greece perhaps harder than just about any other country. You've got very high levels of unemployment, and you've got people who have been concerned about the immigration issue for many years. Keep in mind that Greece is on the front lines of immigration. They have a lot of people coming in over the border from Turkey, and because of the EU's immigration policies, they are basically required as the first place that these people come to deal with the detention, and unfortunately many of them are being detained, as well as just processing a lot of refugees and people. And so people are they're unemployed, they have concerns, they especially young people. And so this ideology that is being put forward is appealing to people who have serious concerns about what is happening economically as well as socially in their country.
Countries where things seem to be going well in a positive direction don't tend to have these parties emerge from the woodwork. Germany, the neo-Nazi right is a criminal problem, not a political problem. They gain a few votes in municipal elections in a few former regions of the former East Germany, but they've never risen above that. And in fact, their numbers have been falling. Germany, of course, is the economic heart of Europe. It's now become the world's largest exporter and so on. Ukraine had an election this past weekend in which the extreme right parties, which we'd been worried about during the protests last year, they seem to have been a force, basically nixed out. Neither of the ultranationalist or extreme right parties managed to pass the 5% vote threshold. They were in the single digits, and people voted overwhelmingly for pro-European parties.
You're encouraged by that, I presume.
A sense of, it's very nice to see Europeans not making those sort of Ukrainians not making those sort of choices. So, is this a reaction to economics? Well, no, not completely either. That's the problem, is there have been other times, and I should say it's also not a reaction to anything having to do with immigration or refugees. There have been times when there have been many more refugees in Europe, like in the early 1990s, much more immigration, and you haven't seen this. So it's a little bit glib to try to attach it directly to economic factors. I mean, really, the awfulness of the economic downturn, we should be celebrating the fact that so few far-right parties did well.
I want to start with the official announcement of that Apple Watch back on the 9th of September. I want you to tell us, how important do you think the launch of that device is to our overall acceptance of so-called wearable technology?
So a pretty good analogy would be something like the MP3 market. More than a decade ago, when Apple first came out with the iPod, there were other MP3 players. Nobody really bought them. Some of them were pretty good, but they never really caught on. And you've got sort of the same situation right now, where you have some smartphones, some smartwatches, but the adoption rate is not very high. And now Apple has come along with something that looks very beautiful and obviously capitalizes on their massive user base to begin with. For them, it's a huge opportunity because it's an entirely new class of product. But the thing is that it has to work with another Apple device, so that's going to keep it a little bit constrained. But it certainly gives you an entirely new class of data that you can then start to mine. The really big opportunity here is sort of health and fitness, otherwise known as a sort of wellness, those metrics, your heart rate, how much time you're spending sitting down, how much time you're spending moving, all that stuff is now up for grabs.
Ramona, what do you think sets it apart from other comparable technology?
Well, I think what Apple does better than anyone else is aesthetics. They understand user experience. And I know we'll talk a little bit, I'm sure, of Google Glass, but the real difference there is Apple makes aspirational devices. I mean, if you even look at the recent launch, when they launched the watch, they were also launching their new iPads, which are now available in gold, which has nothing to do with the technology, with the software, with what's inside, and yet it helps it sell because, of course, these are accessories like anything else. They're things that we want in our lives to make our lives better, and so there is that aspirational component. There is, you cannot deny the aesthetic component of how these things add to our lives. So I think Apple understands that very, very well, that we want things that make our lives better, like any wearable that already exists, whether it's plastic surgery or glasses or contact lenses. We want them to not be clunky additions that turn us into robots. We want them to make us better humans, superhumans.
John, in terms of monitoring your pulse, in terms of monitoring other vital signs, the work that this new device does in those areas, how do you think the Apple Watch compares to other devices out there?
I haven't tested it, but I think what's really interesting with Apple is sort of the ecosystem they're also creating. I think Ramona made great points about the sort of user interface and design side of things. Apple's new health app, I think, is extraordinary. And also the fact that they're now coming out with Apple payment systems, where I think it's like 83% of the credit card industry, at least in the States, is going to allow the sort of near-field communication aspect of the app that they have in the phone. So I say in the phone versus the watch, in the sense that for me, a wearable device is just, basically a really well-designed, which is important, fashionable strap-on computer. So I think the big thing about the Apple Watch is to think, well, what's the Apple ecosystem? Because I think that's their larger play.
Colin, what's your view on how influential this will be in this new generation of equipment?
I think it'll be very influential, especially that the types of data that individuals can collect about themselves, physiological data, data about their behavior, maybe even data about their health. So that raises a lot of interesting questions about how that data will be used, who will use it. For health data, there's a question about whether healthcare providers will be willing to use data from a watch, for example, to diagnose a patient or make decisions about those patients. It's not obvious that they will, because they tend to be cautious about what type of data they use. But it's an interesting conversation, and also, of course, it raises a lot of privacy issues as well.
Let me pick up on that, because you've really opened a can of worms with that, Ramona. People who are early adopters of this kind of technology, do you think they understand or are prepared for the invasion of their privacy that will presumably come along with this?
Well, that's right. You have these new devices, and with these new devices means that there's a whole lot more of our data that's available to big business, to government, to really anybody, potential spouses, friends. Our information is now available, and we tend to want control over that. It's very useful in given situations, but getting into the wrong hands, that's where we get into that science fiction scenario that scares all of us. When you actually say the early adopters, the people who are, the first to line up to get that Apple Watch, are the ones who were the first ones, the journalists mostly, who are getting those Google glasses. They also tend to be the most informed, and so they're aware of the social bargain that they're entering into. They're aware of, you give me this technology, which gives me this new data, which gives me these new capabilities, this new curiosity that I can test this out, and in exchange, I know what I'm getting into.
And they're content with that.
I believe, well, it is an exchange. So the thing about being in the information age, which if we are in any era, it is the information era, is that information becomes power, knowledge becomes a form of currency.
The Massachusetts Institute of Technology, I gather, is working on a medical application for Google Glass, including something called Smile Catcher, which aims to interpret your mental well-being through the number of smiles that are directed your way. The thing can pick it up. Is Google Glass a different level of privacy concern from other so-called wearables?
Yes, I mean, I think that the issue of video and pictures and being able to recognize individuals in near real time, and then pull data also in near real time and tag the face as you're looking through the glass, that's creepy. Well, I think most people will find it creepy. The thing about the smiles is, how accurate is that going to be? And that brings up the issue of accuracy of decisions that are made, because if you start using those systems to draw conclusions, how accurate will it be in determining your mental state? Because if that information is used to make decisions, you really want it to be, at least you want it to be very accurate before you start addressing the privacy issues. But I think it's hard. These are hard questions.
You guys know way more about this than I do, so I'm going to ask your indulgence here, because we're going to play another clip, and you're going to tell me how to pronounce Manisha's last name. The digital health futurist Manish Junja, is that how you say it?
Junasia.
Junasia, thank you. I knew one of you would know. Okay, here he is speaking at an event called Anticipating 2025. This is at Birkbeck College in London, UK, in March 2014. Roll tape.
You approach your smart vending machine in the future. It knows that you've got high cholesterol. It knows that you haven't walked much. It knows you haven't slept that much. You go to select a chocolate bar and a fizzy drink. And the vending machine, because it's got AI and the Internet of Things, actually says, hey, don't you think you should have a coconut water and a granola bar? How do you feel about machines knowing more about the state of your health than you, or even your doctor?
Omar, you want to answer that question?
God, I would punch that vending machine. This is the sort of problem, right? Is when you go to Facebook's main page and you're not logged in, it encourages you to sign up, and it says Facebook is free and always will be. That's not an accurate statement. What it really should say is, Facebook costs no money, because there's always a transaction there. With all these devices, there's going to be a transaction. You are paying. You're just not paying in cash. You're paying with your personal information. And so this is fundamentally the shift that's going to happen in mindset, is people are going to have to understand that these are transactions, and you have to You have to measure the value of each transaction. If I go into a grocery store and I see a $50 chocolate bar, I'm not going to buy it. That value proposition doesn't make sense to me. The same thing in the digital world. A couple of weeks ago, I was on assignment in southern Louisiana. A very difficult place to get around. The land is literally melting into the Gulf of Mexico. And so I turned on my GPS, turned on Google Maps, and I was happy to let Google have my personal information with respect to where I am in exchange for me not driving into a swamp. You know, that's sort of the value proposition here. And you're going to have to make it across the board now. You're going to have to determine how much you want to pay in personal information for a variety of things, including possibly, you know, those vending machines.
That is the Agenda's Week in Review, and you can see all of those programs in their entirety by going to our website, theagenda.tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.